Finally, as promised, a special comment on this terrible moment in American history and those unfortunate and irresponsible Americans who have brought us to it. The America I know and love, the quitter governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, began, is not one in which my parents or my baby with Down syndrome will have to stand in front of Obama's death panel so his bureaucrats can decide based on a subjective judgment of their level of productivity in society whether they are worthy of health care. Such a system is downright evil. Of course it is, Ms. Palin, and that is why it does not exist, has not existed, and would never under this president, nor any other president, ever exist in this country. There is no death panel. There is no judgment based on societal productivity. There is no worthiness test. But there is downright evil, and Ms. Palin, you just served its cause. You shouted fire in a crowded theater, a hot theater, and then today tried to roll it back with, no, sorry, not fire, I meant flashlights. Too little, too late, too obvious. Madam, you are a clear and present danger to the safety and security of this nation. Whether the death panel is something you dreamed or something you dreamed up, whether it is the product of a low intellect and a fevered imagination, or the product of a high intelligence and a sober ability to exploit people, you should be ashamed of yourself for having introduced it into the public discourse, and it should debar you for all time from any position of responsibility or trust in the governance of this nation or any of its states or municipalities. But it will not, because a percentage of America does not want explanations nor serious conversation. It wants panic and the guilty thrill of chaos and an excuse to bash skulls and hang people in effigy. Or not in effigy. Ms. Palin, what in spirit is the difference between this monstrous image of a congressman hanged in effigy and the indefensible smile of pride on that idiot's face and this image? With not one murderer in the mob even feeling the need to hide his face for fear of justice that would never come. They are both, to use your phrase, death panels. Ms. Palin, you might as well have declared that the government is being run by a coven of witches with fake Kenyan birth certificates. And you might as well have told the vast unthinking throng that mistakes your ability to wink for leadership that they should start shooting at Democrats. There'd be no need to tell them to bring the guns. Others have already done that. Somebody left his at an Arizona town hall. And incidentally, madam, you have also forfeited your right to be taken seriously. The next time you claim offense at somebody mentioning your children, you have just exploited your youngest child, dangled him in front of a mindless mob as surely as if you were Michael Jackson. You have used this innocent infant as an excuse to pander to the worst and least of us in this nation. You have used him to create the false image of death panels. The only death panels, Ms. Palin, are the figurative ones you have inspired with such irresponsible, dangerous, facile, vile hate speech. The death of common sense. The death of logic, the death, perhaps, of democracy at the hands of mob rule. If someone is hurt in one of these town halls, pro-reform, anti-reform, or most likely, as these things tend to play out in the real life you know so little about, Ms. Palin, if the hurt befalls an innocent bystander, you will have contributed to that harm. You might very well become, Ms. Palin, the very thing you have sought to create in the lurid imaginations of those spoiling for a fight, waiting for an excuse, looking for a rationalization of their own hatred, their own racism, their own unwillingness to accept democracy. You, Ms. Palin, may yet become the de facto chairman of a death panel. Your higher calling, Ms. Palin. God forgive you, Ms. Palin. It is hardly all Sarah Palin. She is, in fact, a relative newcomer to the orgy of fantasized violence and imagined revolution whose fires have been stoked for weeks, for months, for years by conservatives, but more often by mere mercenaries, men and women who believe nothing, who are in it for the gain or the profit or the sheer kick of bending masses to their will. Glenn Beck, who recoils when somebody actually readies for an attack on one of the FEMA internment camps he so cavalierly invented, who so cowers at the thought that he might get blamed or might lose some of his precious and well-earned gold, that he actually has to plead with his viewers not to become new Timothy McVeighs. Glenn Beck says that, and then comes back 3 days later and jokes about poisoning the Speaker of the House. It is irresistible to you, isn't it? It's the same thrill of irresponsibility, of caveman thought, of the drug addict who suddenly and joyously cares nothing about self-restraint. Sobered momentarily into realizing the prospective outline of the horrible shape at the horizon. Soldiers wounded, shooter says she was liberating, FEMA camp says she saw Glenn Beck tell her to rise up and fight back. awakened to the idea that words you say on television have consequences which you cannot necessarily control, you plead, you almost cry for nonviolence. And yet within 72 hours, the thrill again rises up in your blood and you cannot resist it. You must fantasize about murder. And by the very action of speaking it aloud, you enable others to join you in this Neanderthalian ritual of violence to overcome the enemy. Whether the enemy is real or imagined, or whether the enemy really isn't an enemy at all, and it's just your neighbor with a different point of view, who wants to talk about it, wants to involve you in the decision, even though it is his turn to steer and not yours, and even though you both know that someday our system will give you another turn to steer. But ranting and crying and playing with toys on television does not work if you are advocating compromise and dialogue and thought. It works only for a mountebank, making the promise of magic and power with the underlying inherent threat of carnage and chaos. And now you add, you believe death panels are real, an idea so insane, which mainlines so directly back to the mercenary fantasies of the pathetic Betsy McCoy, that even Sarah Palin backed quickly away from them. But what a scare tactic. The big lie in the flesh. Your dream come true. Which is probably why, Mr. Beck, we have not lately heard much of your 9/12 groups, because there you had the germ of an idea, exploitative perhaps, but at its core, beneficial, calming, unifying, thoughtful, restore the sense of September 12, 2001, not of dread or threat, but of collaboration, of meeting in the middle somewhere, of standing together under one flag and trying to improve the conditions of all Americans. And then somebody from your 9/12 group told its members they should all go to the healthcare reform town hall in Tampa and break it up and shout down anybody who disagreed with them and scuffle with the police and demand not discourse but disaster. Your work, Mr. Beck, your contribution to this. God forgive you. There are other instigators free in the land, nearly all of them in effect untrue believers, men intelligent enough to work their way up the political ladder in this country into the Senate of this nation, and yet suddenly foolish enough, or suddenly opportunistic enough, like Mr. Cornyn of Texas, to float conspiracy theories about the White House using health care reform to try to compile an enemies list, one email address at a time. When 4 years ago, this same senator was saying that the previous White House's pernicious, warrantless, illegal consumption of everybody's email address and everybody's email and everybody's websites, that was defensible and justifiable because, quote, none of your civil liberties matter much after you're dead. And now pushing is Mr. Cornyn, the supposedly independent analysis of the proposed health care reform by the Lewin Group, that 119 million people would have to change their insurance. Mr. Cornyn not knowing, or being paid not to know, that the Lewin Group is wholly owned by an insurance company, the way the Lewin Group gave Mr. Boehner and Mr. Cantor $60,000 apiece. Wholly owned. Then there are the birthers, laughable from the moment they open their mouths, proffering a conspiracy that somehow began with the placement of birth notices in 2 Hawaiian newspapers 48 years ago this month. But people who do not want this president to be president will believe anything. And that is meat for fading commentators like Lou Dobbs, whatever he actually believes, because the birther movement touches another essential part of the defective soul, the need for an excuse. For they need to convince themselves in an immense conspiracy, to place that conviction as a barrier between their actions and the sad reality that they are not the victims of intricate machinations against freedom, but that they are just garden variety, ordinary racists. That they can handle the most limited of integration only in theory. It will take anything that will let them pretend that when they burst into tears and cry that they want their America back, they are not asking for white power, not asking that somebody make the black man in the White House go away. There are other instigators, of course, so obvious, so careless, knowing so well that anybody who desperately wants to believe lies will not even notice the truth standing next to them wearing a big red neon sign, like the just a mom from a few blocks away at the Wisconsin town hall who didn't think anybody might Google her name and find out she was really the ex-vice chairman of the county GOP and part of the campaign of the Republican who lost to the Democrat whose town hall she was at that moment helping to disrupt. Or like the smooth-talking hospital corporate titan, spreading millions around to enable the hate, knowing that none of the haters will ever realize nor care that they have become prostitutes for the healthcare industries. like the people who propagated this widely cut and pasted, quote, line-by-line analysis of the Health Care Reform Act, one that saves right-wingers the trouble of actually reading the bill or thinking about it. This is where the fictions come from, that this is funding ACORN, that it guarantees free health care for illegal immigrants, that it mandates abortions, demands euthanasia. If you read it without knowing the truth, you might shove the right-wingers out of the way at the town halls and start screaming yourself. It seems to have been created by the Liberty Council, an offshoot of Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, a council whose other big policy concern has been the attack on Christmas. Maybe there is the most brazen of them all, that man at the town hall in Connecticut wearing the "We Don't Want Government-Run Health Care" sign above his head while wearing his Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield shirt. You might think it was because he was too stupid to wear something a little less corporately slavish, but given what those around him have read, they not only wouldn't care, they might even take comfort from that logo, that he could boast and that they could hate under the auspices of an actual caring, friendly, ruthless insurance company.